Hello! Ever wondered what JSX actually stands for and how it differs from HTML? Let's find out. Here I prepared a simple code sandbox.io instance to illustrate how JSX, here being used for developing React, is actually different than plain HTML. JSX actually stands for JavaScript with an extension for XML. It's just a language extension that offers an XML-like syntax in the language. And we will see also why that is when we look at the differences to HTML. But we already spot the first difference. We can always self-close elements. Now that wouldn't work in HTML. And to illustrate that, let's do the following. Let's introduce just a little bit of code here. We have a div that includes another div, and then we have some spawns in there. Let's make them 1, 2, 3. We will also see a difference here in a second. But for the moment, let's reload this and let's inspect what this tree looks like. So we start with our top level div, and then we have 4 children. And the first one is just a div that closes, while the other 3 are spawns that have then another child, just a text node. Let's just copy this one, bring it to a w3 schools.com instance, paste it in here, run it, and let's see how that looks like. There's something strange is happening. We see that our structure here on the left hand side, we have a div, then the self-closing div, 3 spawns, the div closes, and then a script tag. But that script is in the body, right? Well, if we print the app instance here, we will see, oh, suddenly script is part of the app. And the reason is there is no self-closing. So if I remove this, it all looks fine, right? And the self-closing is actually treated here as if it would just be open. So it essentially reads it like this. And so you can immediately see this is not the DOM tree we wanted, right? And there's a difference between writing that in HTML. JSX also has nothing to do with React. Yes, it was born from React, but it can be used for anything, and it is really useful for everything that is tree-like in structure. Because we are so used to reading HTML, and HTML just forms a tree, we can use it for everything. So I, for instance, also use it as a special kind of syntax for writing abstract syntax trees in a direct compiler injection mode. So you can use it for really, let's say, more exotic use cases. And you can also use it beyond React. So there are many other front-end frameworks and UI libraries that use JSX actively to transpile to a JavaScript own representation to something that's then later on potentially emitted to the document object model, but maybe to something else, right? In the end, that's just synthetic sugar, and it will emit the create element call under the hood. Okay, so that's with the self-closing. There's another difference in HTML. If we want to have something like input, I just write input. And then there are several tags that are like this. They are self-closing tags, and self-closing tags actually in HTML, they work without having the trailing slash. Actually, it is recommended to leave the trailing slash away. So if you omit that, it has no impact, and our tree here, if we look at that, it looks perfectly fine. Input, spawn, 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 exactly what we wanted. Now in JSX, something like that doesn't even compile. It needs to be closed, so we can have just closing input, that's fine. In HTML that wouldn't be fine, by the way. But what we can also do is just self-close it. And in JSX, that's the recommended way to do it. And that's actually more XML-like. So in XML, we cannot omit a trailing slash for self-closing elements. In JSX, that's the same. Now, final difference, I mean, there are a couple more, especially regarding what these are. They look like the HTML corresponding element. The div is a div, and that's of course on purpose, but it doesn't need to be like that, right? Either way, there are some differences, and what we actually pass in there are not attributes, these are props. Props where we see that it is not directly the attribute. One of them is style, because here we enter actually an object. Another one is, for instance, for. So here it's called HTML for, if it exists. And another one is class name. That's potentially the most well-known one. So instead of class, it's class name. That's actually just a React kind of notation. Other JSX-based frameworks, they actually use class, and they are completely fine with that. But again, this is not a one-to-one mapping, so that's completely free now of the function that actually takes this. So the function that the JSX expression is compiled to, is transpiled to, and that function is completely free what to do now with these props, right? And how to map them and what it all corresponds to. And therefore, as a mental model, it makes sense kinda to think of what we write here as HTML, but only for the 80–90%. The rest, you really need to be aware of that this is not HTML, and actually it has no direct correspondence to HTML. Final thing that I wanted to raise is this 1, 2, 3 example. Here we see they are, well, without any spaces in between. Now, if we bring the same thing over, and we render it here, you see they have spaces in between, right? So this is space and this is space, and that's a huge difference actually. And it is quite simple. The team that developed JSX knew from the beginning that, well, the reason they come up with the syntax is to make it more readable. And to make it readable, you need to have indentation. And we are quite used to, let's say, such a structure of HTML that we can see the tree structure evolving in front of our eyes. Now, if we would take the same approach as HTML, what we have here is a text node, and it's a new line and some spaces, and that actually is then in rendering collapsed to just a single space. Of course, it all depends on the CSS that's behind it, but nevertheless, that's how HTML works. So the text node is always there. The only question is it rendered? Now what JSX does is, it says, oh, well, there's a new line, so I don't do anything. And you can place also some spaces afterwards. It will ignore them. So the only thing, if you don't want to, if it ignored, is to either change how you, let's say, structure here your code. So you just place more children in the same line, it's fine. Or to be explicit and to say, yeah, let's go into expression mode. Let's just print one space, and there you go. So you can do this, and then it's equivalent more or less to the HTML version. But again, JSX will not print out any new line and indentation level spaces just because you have them there. You need to work for this, and in the 80–90% case, or maybe even 99%, that's totally fine, right? And for the edge cases, you can always use things like an expression switch. I hope you learned something. If you want to see more about these differences or want to go in some detail, just leave a comment or message me. I wish you all a happy day. Stay healthy.